The veteran rancher rode at dawn to check his cattle and found a native girl guarding them alone. The silence was wrong. After 30 years working cattle in the Wyoming Territory, Samuel Hayes knew every sound that belonged to dawn on the range. The gentle lowing of cattle settling for the night, the whisper of wind through sagebrush, the distant call of a coyote testing its luck against the coming light. But this morning, riding out from his ranch house as the first pale fingers of sunrise stretched across the endless prairie, something felt different. His weathered hands gripped the reins tighter as his horse, a steady bay mare named Copper, picked her way carefully through the rocky terrain toward the northern pasture. The cattle should be there, scattered across the valley floor, grazing peacefully in the early morning calm. Should be. But the wrongness in the air made his gut clench, with the kind of instinct that had kept him alive through Indian raids, rustlers, and the brutal winters that claimed weaker men. The wind carried no scent of his herd, no familiar sounds drifted across the distance. Just an eerie quiet that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up like a spooked horse sensing a rattlesnake. Samuel had built his spread from nothing, starting with a handful of cattle and a dream bigger than the vast Montana sky. 40 head had grown to nearly 300 over the years, each animal representing countless hours of backbreaking work, sleepless nights during calving season, and the kind of dedication that carved lines deep into a man's face and calluses thick on his hands. The ranch house sat small and weathered against the immense backdrop of rolling hills that stretched to the horizon in every direction. It was a simple structure, built from local timber and stones pulled from the creek bed, but it was home. More importantly, it was proof that a man could carve out his place in this unforgiving land, if he was willing to pay the price in sweat and sacrifice. As Copper crested the ridge overlooking the northern pasture, Samuel's blood ran cold. The valley spread out below him like a scene from a nightmare. His cattle were there, but they were not scattered and grazing as they should be. Instead, they huddled together in tight groups, their usual calm replaced by an obvious agitation that made them mill about nervously, their eyes rolling white with fear. But it was not the behavior of his herd that made Samuel's hand instinctively move to the Colt 45 at his hip. It was the figure standing among them, small and still as a statue, that made his breath catch in his throat. A young woman, clearly of Indian descent, stood in the center of the pasture. She could not have been more than 18 or 19 years old, her long black hair hanging loose down her back, wearing a simple buckskin dress that marked her as definitely not from any nearby settlement. She stood with her back to him, perfectly motionless, as if she had been there all night watching over his cattle like some kind of guardian spirit. Samuel's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. The Indian wars had been brutal in this territory, leaving scars on both sides that would take generations to heal. Treaties had been signed and broken, promises made and forgotten, until trust between white settlers and the native tribes had become as rare as water in the desert. His cattle were worth everything to him. They represented his life's work, his future, his security against the harsh realities of frontier life. If this girl was part of a raiding party, if she was here to steal his herd or drive them off, he would fight to protect what was his. But something about her stillness, her apparent lack of fear or aggression, made him hesitate. The morning light grew stronger, painting the grassland in shades of gold and amber. The girl had not moved, had not even turned to acknowledge his presence on the ridge, though she must have heard Copper's hoofbeats on the rocky ground. She simply stood there, as if she belonged in that place, as if she had every right to be among his cattle. Samuel urged Copper down the slope, his hand never leaving the grip of his pistol. Every instinct told him to be ready for trouble, to expect the worst, but curiosity warred with caution in his mind. What was she doing here? Where had she come from? And why did his cattle seem so calm in her presence when they should be spooked by a stranger? As he drew closer, he could see that she was young, probably no more than a girl, really, with delicate features and an air of quiet dignity that seemed to radiate from her small form. Her dress was well made, decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the early light, and her moccasins were crafted with the kind of skill that spoke of tradition and heritage. But it was her complete lack of fear that unsettled him most. She stood among 300 head of cattle, any one of which could trample her without effort, yet she seemed as comfortable as if she were standing in her own garden. The animals moved around her with unusual gentleness, some even approaching close enough that she could have reached out and touched them. Samuel reined in Copper about 50 yards away, close enough to be heard but far enough to react if this was some kind of trap. His voice carried across the morning air, rough with years of shouting commands over the wind and the sound of cattle. "You there? What are you doing with my herd?" The girl turned slowly, gracefully, as if she had been expecting him all along. Her face was striking, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of wisdom far beyond her apparent years. When she looked at him, Samuel felt as if she could see straight through to his soul, reading everything he had ever done, every choice he had made, every secret he had kept. "Your cattle were frightened," she said, her voice clear and musical, speaking English with only the faintest trace of an accent. "I stayed to keep them calm." The simplicity of her answer caught him off guard. No explanation of where she had come from, no justification for her presence on his land, just a matter-of-fact statement that left him with more questions than answers. "Frightened of what?" Samuel asked, his eyes scanning the surrounding area for signs of whatever might have spooked his normally placid herd. "Wolves," the girl replied. "A pack came down from the mountains last night. They were hungry, desperate. Your cattle scattered in panic, but I was able to gather them here, in this protected valley, where the wolves could not surround them." Samuel studied her face, looking for any sign of deception, but found only calm honesty. Wolves were a constant threat to cattle ranchers, and a pack desperate enough to come down from the high country could easily have killed several head before he even knew they were there. The loss could have been devastating, potentially ruining him financially. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" he asked, though something in her manner made him want to believe her. Without a word, the girl walked to the edge of the pasture and pointed to the soft earth near the creek. Even from his position on horseback, Samuel could see the tracks pressed into the mud. Wolf prints, large and clear, circling the area where his cattle now grazed peacefully. "They tried to attack twice during the night," she continued. "But cattle are easier to protect when they stay together. I sang to them, kept them calm, and the wolves eventually gave up and returned to the mountains." Samuel dismounted and walked closer to examine the tracks. They were fresh, probably no more than a few hours old, and there were enough of them to indicate a sizable pack. The girl was right. If his cattle had been scattered and panicked, the wolves could have picked them off one by one. "What's your name?" he asked, straightening up to look at her directly. "Ayana," she replied. "It means eternal blossom in my language." "Well, Ayana, seems like I owe you a debt of gratitude. Those wolves could have cost me everything." She nodded slightly, accepting his thanks with the same quiet dignity she had shown from the beginning. "I was traveling through your land and saw the danger. It would have been wrong to do nothing." "Traveling where?" "There's nothing but open country for 50 miles in any direction." "I am going to the fort," she said, "to find work as a translator. The soldiers need someone who can speak both English and the languages of the tribes." Samuel knew the fort she meant. It was a hard 3-day ride across some of the most unforgiving terrain in the territory, and she was making the journey alone, on foot, with nothing but the clothes on her back and whatever supplies she could carry. "That's dangerous country for anyone, especially a young woman traveling alone," he said. "I am not afraid," Ayana replied simply. "I have been taking care of myself for a long time." There was something in her tone, a hint of sadness or loss, that made Samuel wonder what circumstances had led her to this point. But he was not a man to pry into other people's business, and she had already done him a service that deserved respect rather than interrogation. The sun was climbing higher now, warming the air and bringing the promise of another hot day on the range. Samuel's cattle had settled into their normal grazing patterns, apparently none the worse for their frightening night. But he could not shake the feeling that sending this girl on her way alone would be wrong somehow. "The fort's a hard journey," he said carefully. "Dangerous for anyone, but especially for someone on foot. If you're willing to help me move these cattle back to the home pasture, I could provide you with a horse and supplies for the trip." Ayana studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether his offer was genuine or had some hidden motive. Finally, she nodded. "That would be fair payment for the service I have already provided," she said. Samuel smiled, the first genuine smile he had worn in weeks. "Fair enough. Let's get these cattle moving then." Working together, they began the process of gathering the scattered herd and moving them toward the main ranch. Samuel was impressed by Ayana's natural ability with the animals. She seemed to understand their movements and moods instinctively, positioning herself at exactly the right spots to guide them without causing panic or confusion. As they worked, Samuel found himself stealing glances at his unexpected helper. She moved with a grace and confidence that spoke of someone who had grown up in harmony with the natural world, reading the signs and signals that most people missed entirely. Her presence had a calming effect, not only on the cattle, but on Samuel himself, though he could not quite explain why. The morning sun climbed higher as they pushed the herd across the grassland toward the ranch house. The work was hot and dusty, but Ayana never complained or showed signs of fatigue. She simply did what needed to be done, anticipating problems before they developed and solving them with quiet efficiency. By midday, they had the cattle safely secured in the home pasture, close enough to the ranch buildings that Samuel could keep a watchful eye on them. He invited Ayana to join him for a meal before she continued her journey, and she accepted with the same quiet dignity she had shown all morning. The ranch house was simple but clean, reflecting the practical nature of a man who had built his life around hard work and self-reliance. Samuel prepared a meal of beef, beans, and fresh bread, along with coffee strong enough to wake the dead. As they ate, he found himself curious about her story, though he tried to keep his questions respectful. "You speak English very well," he observed. "Where did you learn?" "My mother was captured by settlers when she was young," Ayana replied matter-of-factly. "She learned English during the years she lived with them before she was able to return to her people. She taught me both languages from the time I was small." Samuel nodded, understanding that such stories were common in the territory. The lines between white and Indian communities were often blurred by circumstances beyond anyone's control, creating people who lived between two worlds and belonged fully to neither. "What about your father?" he asked gently. "He died fighting the cavalry 2 winters ago," she said without emotion. "Many of our people died that winter." The simple statement carried a weight of grief and loss that made Samuel's chest tighten. He had seen enough death and violence in his years on the frontier to understand what those words meant, not just for Ayana, but for countless families on both sides of the ongoing conflict. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. Ayana looked up from her plate, meeting his eyes directly. "He died defending his people. It was a good death." After the meal, Samuel went to the barn to select a horse for Ayana's journey. He chose a sturdy sorrel gelding named Buck, gentle enough for a woman to handle but tough enough to make the hard ride to the fort. He also packed supplies, food, water, a blanket, and a small amount of money that might be useful at the fort. As he prepared the horse, Samuel found himself reluctant to see Ayana leave. Her presence had brought something to the ranch that he had not realized was missing. Perhaps it was simply the novelty of having another person around. Or maybe it was the quiet strength she radiated that made even the most difficult tasks seem manageable. "Buck's a good horse," he said, handing her the reins. "He'll get you to the fort safely if you treat him right." "I will take good care of him," Ayana promised, running her hand along the horse's neck with obvious affection. Samuel watched as she mounted the horse with practiced ease, settling into the saddle as if she had been riding all her life. The sight of her preparing to leave triggered an unexpected pang of loneliness that caught him off guard. "Ayana," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "If things don't work out at the fort, if you need a place to stay, you're welcome to come back here. I could use help with the cattle, and you've already proven you're good with them." She looked down at him from the saddle, her dark eyes unreadable. "That is kind of you, Samuel Hayes. I will remember your offer." "How did you know my name?" he asked, realizing he had never introduced himself. "The wolves told me," she said with the faintest hint of a smile. "They said the rancher who lived here was a good man, even if he was stubborn and set in his ways." Samuel laughed despite himself. "Well, I reckon the wolves know me pretty well by now." Ayana turned the horse toward the trail that would take her east toward the fort. "Thank you for the horse and the supplies. I will not forget your kindness." As she rode away, Samuel stood in the dusty yard of his ranch, watching until she disappeared over the ridge. The silence that settled over the land felt different now, not comfortable and familiar, but empty somehow, as if an important piece of the landscape had been removed. He tried to return to his normal routine, but found his thoughts constantly drifting to the young woman who had appeared out of nowhere to save his cattle and then disappeared just as mysteriously. He wondered if she would find the work she was seeking at the fort, if she would be safe on the dangerous trail, if he would ever see her again. Days passed, then weeks. Samuel threw himself into his work with renewed intensity, repairing fences, checking on his cattle, and preparing for the approaching winter. But no matter how busy he kept himself, he could not shake the memory of Ayana's calm presence among his frightened cattle, or the way she had looked at him with those dark, knowing eyes. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Samuel heard the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching. His hand moved instinctively to his gun, but something about the rhythm of the approaching horse told him this was not a threat. A lone rider appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the dying light. Even at that distance, Samuel recognized the graceful posture and the familiar sorrel horse. Ayana was returning. She rode into the yard as the last light faded from the sky, looking tired but unharmed. Samuel stood up from his chair, his heart beating faster than it should have at the sight of her. "The fort didn't work out?" he asked. "The work was there," she replied, dismounting from Buck with the same fluid grace he remembered. "But the life was not. Too many people, too much noise, too many walls between me and the sky." Samuel nodded, understanding what she meant. He had spent time in towns and cities, and they had always left him feeling trapped and restless. The open country was in his blood, just as it was apparently in hers. "The offer still stands," he said. "I could use a partner who knows cattle and isn't afraid of hard work." Ayana looked around the ranch, taking in the simple buildings, the wide pastures, and the endless sky above. "It is peaceful here," she said. "Quiet in a good way. It can be lonely sometimes," Samuel admitted. "But it's honest work, and the land doesn't care about the color of your skin or where you came from." "And you?" she asked, meeting his eyes directly. "Do you care about those things?" Samuel considered the question seriously. In his younger years, he might have answered differently. The prejudices of his time and place had been ingrained in him from childhood, but decades of frontier life had taught him to judge people by their actions rather than their ancestry. "I care about whether someone can do the work and be trusted," he said finally. "Everything else is just talk." Ayana smiled, and Samuel felt something shift inside his chest, like a piece of machinery that had been stuck finally clicking into place. "Then I would like to accept your offer," she said, "if you will have me as a partner." Samuel extended his hand and she took it, sealing their agreement with a firm handshake. Her hand was small, but calloused from hard work, and her grip was strong and sure. "Welcome home, partner," he said, and knew that he meant it in every sense of the word. In the months that followed, Samuel discovered that having Ayana as a partner transformed not only his ranch, but his entire outlook on life. She brought skills and knowledge that complemented his own experience, reading the weather patterns with uncanny accuracy and understanding the behavior of animals in ways that constantly amazed him. Together, they expanded the herd, improved the grazing land, and built additional structures that made the ranch more efficient and comfortable. But more than that, they built a life together based on mutual respect, shared goals, and the kind of deep friendship that develops between people who have faced hardship together and emerged stronger. As winter approached, Samuel realized that the emptiness he had felt for so many years was gone, replaced by a sense of completeness he had never experienced before. The ranch was still his life's work, but now it was something more. It was a home he shared with someone who understood him, supported him, and brought out the best in him. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a long day of moving cattle to winter pasture, Samuel looked across at Ayana and felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. She had appeared in his life like a guardian angel, saving his cattle from the wolves and staying to save him from a loneliness he had not even realized was consuming him. "I never asked you," he said softly. "What made you decide to help my cattle that night? You could have just kept walking." Ayana looked up from the leather harness she was repairing, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "My grandmother used to say that the spirits sometimes send us exactly where we need to be, even when we do not understand why. I think I was meant to find you that morning, just as you were meant to find me." Samuel nodded, understanding that some things could not be explained by logic or reason. The connection between them had been immediate and profound, transcending the barriers of race and culture that might have kept them apart in a different time and place. "I'm glad the spirits knew what they were doing," he said with a smile. "So am I," Ayanna replied, returning to her work with a contentment that filled the small room like warmth from the fire. Outside, the wind whistled across the prairie, carrying the promise of winter and the challenges that lay ahead. But inside the ranch house, Samuel and Ayanna sat together in comfortable silence, two souls who had found their place in the world and in each other's lives. The veteran rancher had ridden out at dawn to check his cattle and found a native girl guarding them alone. What he had not expected was to find in her a partner, a friend, and a missing piece of himself that he had not even known was lost. In the vast emptiness of the Wyoming Territory, two people from different worlds had discovered that home was not just a place but a feeling, and that sometimes the most important journeys were the ones that brought you exactly where you belonged. The winter months tested their partnership in ways Samuel had not anticipated. The Wyoming Territory was unforgiving during the coldest season, with temperatures dropping so low that breath froze in the air, and the wind carried a bite that could cut through the thickest coat. But working alongside Ayanna, Samuel discovered that the burdens of ranch life became lighter when shared with someone who understood both the land and the animals with such intuitive wisdom. Ayanna's knowledge of natural remedies proved invaluable when several cattle fell ill with a respiratory infection that could have decimated the herd. While Samuel would have relied on costly veterinary medicines from town, she prepared treatments from herbs and roots she gathered from the surrounding prairie, brewing teas and poultices that nursed the sick animals back to health with remarkable effectiveness. Her understanding of weather patterns also saved them from potential disaster. One morning in late January, she woke Samuel before dawn, urgency in her voice, as she warned him of an approaching blizzard that would be far worse than anything the sky currently showed. Despite clear skies and mild temperatures, Samuel trusted her judgment and spent the day moving cattle to the protected valley near the ranch house, securing extra feed and battening down the buildings. The storm hit that night with a fury that made the ranch house shake on its foundation. Wind howled across the prairie with the voice of a banshee, driving snow horizontally and creating drifts that reached the roofline. For 3 days, the world outside disappeared in a whirlwind of white death, and Samuel knew that if his cattle had been caught in the open pastures, he would have lost everything. During those long nights trapped inside by the storm, Samuel and Ayanna talked in ways they had never done before. She told him stories of her childhood, of growing up in a world where the relationship between humans and nature was sacred, where every animal and plant had its place in the great circle of life. Her voice was musical as she described the traditions of her people, the ceremonies that marked the changing seasons, and the wisdom passed down through generations of living in harmony with the land. Samuel found himself sharing memories he had never spoken aloud, tales of his own childhood on a farm back east, of the dreams that had driven him west, and of the loneliness that had been his constant companion for more years than he cared to count. In the warm glow of the firelight, with the storm raging outside, he felt a connection to another human being that he had never experienced before. When the storm finally passed, they emerged to find a world transformed. The familiar landscape was buried under feet of snow, creating new contours and hiding familiar landmarks. But their cattle were safe in the protected valley, and the ranch buildings had weathered the storm without serious damage. Working together to dig out paths and restore normal operations, Samuel marveled at how naturally they functioned as a team, anticipating each other's needs and actions, without the need for constant communication. Spring arrived with the explosion of life that seemed to mirror the growth of their partnership. The prairie burst into bloom with wildflowers of every color imaginable, and the cattle grew fat on the new grass that pushed up through the warming soil. Ayanna taught Samuel to read the subtle signs that indicated the best grazing areas, the places where the grass would be richest and most nutritious for the growing herd. Their success was evident in the improved condition of the cattle and the expansion of the herd through a successful calving season. But more than that, Samuel could feel the difference in himself. The constant tension that had marked his previous years of solitary ranch life was gone, replaced by a deep contentment that came from knowing he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do, with exactly the right person beside him. As summer approached, they decided to expand their operation, adding a small garden where Ayanna could grow the herbs and vegetables that supplemented their diet, and provided natural remedies for both humans and animals. Samuel watched with fascination as she worked the soil with her hands, planting seeds according to ancient knowledge about moon phases and seasonal cycles that produced results far superior to anything he had achieved through trial and error. The garden became a place of peace and reflection, where they often sat in the evenings after the day's work was done, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors while discussing plans for the future. It was during one of these quiet moments that Samuel realized his feelings for Ayanna had evolved beyond partnership and friendship into something deeper and more profound. The realization came gradually, like the slow lightening of the sky before dawn. He found himself looking forward to her smile when he brought her coffee in the morning, treasuring the sound of her laughter when something amused her, and feeling a protective instinct that went far beyond what he would feel for any business partner. But more than that, he had come to depend on her presence in ways that went to the very core of his being. Yet he was also aware of the complexities their situation presented. In a territory where racial tensions ran high and mixed relationships were viewed with suspicion and often hostility, any romantic connection between them would face obstacles that went far beyond the normal challenges of building a life together. The thought of exposing Ayanna to the prejudice and potential violence of narrow-minded people made his blood run cold. But as the weeks passed, Samuel began to notice signs that suggested his feelings might be reciprocated. The way Ayanna's eyes lingered on his face when she thought he was not looking, the gentle touch of her hand when she passed him tools or served him meals, the way she seemed to position herself close to him when they worked together. These small gestures spoke of an intimacy that went beyond mere friendship or business partnership. The moment of truth came during a particularly challenging day in late summer when they were working to bring in a group of cattle that had wandered too far from the main herd. The animals were spooked by something, possibly a mountain lion or bear, and were scattered across several miles of rough terrain. Working together, Samuel and Ayanna managed to gather most of the herd, but several head were still missing as darkness began to fall. Against his better judgment, Samuel decided to continue the search into the night, knowing that cattle left alone in the darkness would be vulnerable to predators. Ayanna insisted on accompanying him, despite his concerns for her safety, and together they rode out into the moonlit prairie armed with lanterns and the hope that they could locate the missing animals before it was too late. They found the cattle huddled in a small canyon, terrorized by a large black bear that was clearly considering them as potential prey. The bear was massive, probably weighing over 400 pounds, and showed no inclination to retreat when it saw the approaching humans. Instead, it reared up on its hind legs and let out a roar that echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. Samuel's horse shied violently, nearly throwing him from the saddle, while his rifle flew from his hands and clattered across the rocky ground. The bear dropped back to all fours and began advancing toward them, its eyes reflecting the lantern light like twin flames of menace. Samuel scrambled to retrieve his weapon, but he knew he would never reach it in time. It was then that Ayanna did something that would be burned into Samuel's memory for the rest of his life. She began to sing, her voice rising clear and strong in the night air, carrying a melody that seemed to come from the very heart of the wilderness itself. The song was in her native language, but Samuel could feel its power even without understanding the words. It was a song of respect, of acknowledgement, of one creature recognizing the dignity and right to exist of another. The bear stopped its advance, tilting its massive head, as if listening to something it had not heard in a very long time. The tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by something that felt almost like understanding. Slowly, majestically, the great animal turned and walked away into the darkness, leaving the cattle and the humans unharmed. Samuel sat in his saddle, stunned by what he had just witnessed. He had seen many things in his years on the frontier, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of a young woman calming a dangerous wild animal with nothing but her voice and the ancient wisdom of her people. "How did you know to do that?" he asked when he finally found his voice. "All creatures understand the language of respect," Ayanna replied simply. "The bear was not evil or malicious. It was simply hungry and saw an opportunity. When I acknowledged its right to exist and asked for understanding, it chose to find its meal elsewhere." As they herded the cattle back toward the ranch, Samuel found himself overwhelmed by emotions he had been trying to suppress for weeks. The courage Ayanna had shown, the wisdom she had demonstrated, and the complete trust she had placed in him by riding out into danger at his side, all combined to break down the last barriers around his heart. When they reached the ranch house, Samuel helped Ayanna down from her horse, his hands lingering on her waist as their eyes met in the moonlight. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, and Samuel felt as if he was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to leap into the unknown. "Ayanna," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion, "I need to tell you something." She looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the stars above. "I know," she said simply, "and I feel the same way." The kiss that followed was gentle and tentative at first, as if both of them were afraid to fully acknowledge what was happening between them. But as the moment stretched on, it deepened into something that spoke of months of growing attraction, mutual respect, and the kind of love that develops between two people who have faced hardship together and emerged stronger. When they finally separated, Samuel rested his forehead against hers, breathing in the scent of her hair and marveling at the rightness of holding her in his arms. "This won't be easy," he said, voicing the concerns that had been plaguing him for weeks. "People won't understand. They'll make life difficult for us." "I know," Ayanna replied, her voice steady and sure, "but I have never chosen the easy path, and I do not intend to start now. If you are willing to face whatever comes, then so am I." Samuel pulled her closer, feeling as if a weight he had been carrying for years had finally been lifted from his shoulders. "Then we'll face it together," he said. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." The months that followed were both the happiest and most challenging of Samuel's life. Their relationship deepened and strengthened as they worked side by side to build their shared future. But they also faced the reality of living in a time and place where their love was viewed with suspicion and often outright hostility by many in the surrounding community. The first real test came when they rode into town together for supplies, and Samuel could feel the stares and whispered comments that followed them down the dusty main street. Some people turned away in disgust, while others watched with the kind of morbid curiosity usually reserved for traveling sideshows. But Samuel kept his hand on Ayanna's arm, making it clear to anyone who cared to notice that she was under his protection and that he would not tolerate any disrespect. The storekeeper, a man named Henderson, who had always been cordial in his business dealings with Samuel, was noticeably cool and distant. His wife, a sharp-faced woman who had never liked anyone who did not fit her narrow definition of respectability, made pointed comments about the decline of moral standards in the territory. But there were also unexpected sources of support. The local doctor, a man who had seen enough suffering to understand the value of human kindness regardless of its source, went out of his way to speak respectfully to both Samuel and Ayanna. An elderly widow who ran the boarding house nodded approvingly when she saw them together, later telling Samuel that she had never seen him look so content and at peace. The real crisis came in the form of a delegation from the territorial government, led by a pompous official named Crawford, who had appointed himself as a guardian of public morality. Crawford arrived at the ranch unannounced one morning, accompanied by 2 armed deputies and a thick folder of legal documents that he claimed gave him the authority to investigate reports of immoral conduct. Samuel met them in the yard, his own rifle prominently displayed across his arms, making it clear that they were not welcome on his property. But Crawford was not easily intimidated, and he had come prepared for resistance. "Mr. Hayes," Crawford began, his voice dripping with false authority, "it has been brought to our attention that you are cohabiting with a savage woman in violation of both territorial law and Christian morality. I am here to inform you that such behavior will not be tolerated in a civilized community." Samuel felt his anger rising like a tide, but he forced himself to remain calm. "This is my property, Crawford, and I'll live on it however I see fit. You have no authority here." "On the contrary," Crawford replied, pulling out a document and waving it in the air. "I have been appointed by the territorial governor to investigate reports of immoral conduct and to take appropriate action to preserve the peace and stability of our communities. That savage woman must be removed from this property immediately, or you will face the consequences." It was at that moment that Ayanna appeared in the doorway of the ranch house, her presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone in the yard. She was dressed in a simple but elegant dress that Samuel had purchased for her in town, her long hair braided in a style that combined elements of both white and Indian fashion. She looked every inch the lady, but there was also something in her bearing that spoke of strength and dignity that could not be diminished by the prejudice of small-minded men. "I am not a savage," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I am a woman who has chosen to build a life with a man I love and respect. If that offends you, then perhaps you should examine your own heart rather than trying to regulate mine." Crawford's face reddened with anger and embarrassment. "You have no right to speak to me, woman. Your kind does not understand the complexities of civilized society." "My kind?" Ayanna replied, stepping forward with a grace that made Crawford instinctively step back. "You mean the kind who can speak 4 languages, who can heal sick animals with natural remedies, who can read weather patterns and prevent disaster? Or do you mean the kind who can face down a charging bear with nothing but courage and wisdom?" Samuel felt a surge of pride as he watched Ayanna stand her ground against men who had come to intimidate and humiliate her. Her dignity and intelligence were so obviously superior to their crude prejudices that even Crawford's deputies seemed uncomfortable with their mission. "This is not a debate," Crawford blustered, clearly losing ground in the confrontation. "I have the law on my side, and I have the right to defend my property and my family," Samuel replied, raising his rifle slightly. "Now I suggest you get off my land before I decide you're trespassing." The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with neither side willing to back down. But eventually Crawford realized that he was outnumbered and outgunned, and that his legal authority meant nothing in the face of a determined man defending his home. With as much dignity as he could muster, he retreated to his horse and rode away, but not before promising that the matter was far from over. The incident left both Samuel and Ayanna shaken, not because they had been intimidated, but because it made clear the extent of the opposition they would face in building their life together. But it also strengthened their resolve and deepened their commitment to each other. They had faced down their enemies together and emerged victorious, and the experience had bonded them in ways that went beyond mere romantic attraction. In the weeks that followed, Samuel and Ayanna made the decision to formalize their relationship in the eyes of the law, despite the obstacles such a step would create. They traveled to the territorial capital, where a sympathetic judge agreed to perform the ceremony in a private setting that would avoid the kind of public spectacle that could endanger their safety. The wedding was simple but deeply meaningful, with vows that spoke of their commitment not just to each other, but to the life they were building together on the Wyoming prairie. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel felt as if he had finally found his place in the world, not just as a rancher or a landowner, but as a man who had found his perfect partner in life. The return to their ranch marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, one that would be filled with challenges and triumphs, setbacks and victories, but always grounded in the love and respect they had for each other. They had proven that 2 people from different worlds could find common ground and build something beautiful together, and that the barriers erected by prejudice and fear could be overcome by courage and determination. As they stood together on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, Samuel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with a simple ride to check on cattle and the discovery of a mysterious young woman who had appeared like a guardian angel to protect his herd. But it had evolved into something far more profound and lasting, a love story that would endure long after the prejudices of their time had been forgotten. The veteran rancher had indeed ridden out at dawn to check his cattle and found a native girl guarding them alone. But what he had truly discovered was his destiny, his purpose, and his heart's deepest desire. In the vast emptiness of the Wyoming territory, 2 souls had found each other and created something that would stand as a testament to the power of love to overcome any obstacle.